When that scholarship has focused its lens on religion, it has revealed the complex ways women successfully engage traditions, exercise agency, and negotiate political terrains, all without equality. At the same time, this scholarship has also revealed the harsh workings of patriarchy through religious traditions. Anthropologists have been particularly effective at demonstrating flexibility of religious practices that lie beneath what appears to be inflexible religious traditions and law. Under the banner of what was once called the little tradition, or more precisely the focus on practice as against norms, or orality as against textuality, women were revealed to have far more power and forms of authority than imagined. In Judaism, ethnographic studies demonstrated the power of domestic religion in the work of Barbara Meyerhoff and Susan Sered. Studies of Orthodox women by Tamar El-Or and Stephanie Levine suggest complex ideas held by women about their practice and their understanding of themselves. These studies complicated any understanding of the relationship between women and culture if the primary questions focus on access, experience, and practice of religious life. These perspectives on women and religion are in conversation with and often a direct challenge to the foundational work on women and religion undertaken by feminist scholars, anthropologists among them. This scholarship was both, not to say that the other women weren't feminist scholars, but they went about it very differently than the ones I'm going to talk about now. This scholarship was both critical to the development of feminist thought and reflected the activism of second-wave feminism. In the early 1970s, a number of scholars, Mary Daly, the best known, wrote about the patriarchal nature of Judaism and Christianity, particularly the Catholic Church. Her book, God the Father, published in 1973, which made the cover of Time magazine, not something that happens to all academics, underlined the gendered nature of God, the Hebrew and Christian Bibles, and the Church. In 1970, Rachel Adler published an article in a small and obscure magazine that nevertheless launched Jewish feminism. The Jew Who Wasn't There, her article, argued that the fundamental premise of Jewish law was that women were not and could not be Jewish adults in the ways that males are. Their status, she argued, was more akin to children and gamblers, pigeon gamblers in particular. Boys could grow up, gamblers could reform, but women would remain forever outside the domain of a full adult status for Jews. These works remain emblematic of the feminist critique of Western religion. Though Daly and Adler developed very different types of relationships to their own religious traditions, they did share an understanding of the patriarchy. They underlined the fact that what was often papered over through praise or idealization of women could not obscure what was apparent in texts, in representations of women, and in practice. At its most blunt, religion could be regarded as a tool of patriarchy. In the 40 years that have followed this critique of Judaism, increasingly within the Orthodox community, feminists have not challenged Jewish practices so much as the exclusion of women from them, developing a variety of grounds for rejecting the gender hierarchy of Jewish law. What I am glossing as two very general and apparently contradictory ways, feminist ways of studying religion by anthropologists and others, nicely replicates a much deeper understanding of the paradox of feminism as both a product and a critique of modernity. It was that paradox I found in early efforts to integrate women in Judaism in the 19th century. The historian Joan Wallach Scott's analysis of the paradoxical nature of feminist thought is among the most cogent I know. She argues that the feminist call for equality is of course a product of modernity, the soil in which the demands for equal rights was nourished. As feminists engage the discourse of rights and equality for example, education or the vote or access to participation in the full range of social life, they do so asserting that the promises of modernity were a sham for all but a remarkably few who participated in society. The Enlightenment and its vision for citizenship was in fact grounded in patriarchy, in a hierarchic system that presumed the inferiority of other races, religions, cultures, and of course, gender and sexualities. What Enlightenment gave it also took away. That paradox, however, was only part of the problem. This second paradox involved the very notion of women. If the political movement for equality was based on women's shared status, then the universality of women's condition created the same chicanery as the Enlightenment claims of human equality. Women may share some things, but their differences have consistently challenged the possibility of imagining a shared reality or condition for, as some would say, quote unquote, women. Whether the issue has been sexuality, class, race, geopolitics, feminist claims cannot unify women because of the vast differences among them. Religion has served as one of those critical forms of differentiation among women that undermines the promise of unity. As feminists draw on modernity to claim equality, they reject religion as its antithesis. Joan Scott suggests that what we might put in a classic formulation, that religion is to modernity as women are to men. Women, like religion, is too emotional, too embodied, and too weak. Science, property, citizenship, and reason are the domains of the male. Religion, emotions, embodiment, and dependence are the worlds of women. Therefore, particularly for the founding generation of feminist scholarship, feminism and religion were antithetical. Women could not claim a religious life because religion was fundamentally a tool of oppression. Scott suggests that the only antidote to this unproductive binary thinking is to ask that feminist scholars begin to deconstruct secularism, just as they have universalism, liberalism, and nationalism, in order to understand its intellectual genealogy and to refocus on the ways in which women negotiate both the terrain of the secular and the religious. Scott's work is, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is on Islam in France, and she's written about the issue of headscarves in schools. She is particularly concerned about French feminists' refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of women's rights to cover their heads as feminists. What interests me about Jewish feminism is that it offers a kind of middle term to the binary so powerfully laid out by Joan Scott. If second-wave feminists laid claim to equality by dismissing religion as a tool of patriarchy, so too did second-wave feminists engage religious traditions to reshape and reinterpret them. In analyzing the different feminist claims on Judaism, we have an interesting view on the feminist paradox. We can only understand the meaning of equality by carefully unpacking it in its historical context in which it was created and through the meanings ascribed to it. I want, therefore, to look with you at three meanings of equality in Jewish feminism over a century, a period of a century, in order to understand the effort to equalize rather than reject patriarchal religions, and then its effect on this paradox that I'm discussing. As I noted at the outset, the inequality between men and women in Judaism rests on Jewish law. For those of you unfamiliar with it, gender confers status in Judaism. Men and women are differentiated fundamentally by their religious obligations. While they share the same negative commandments, prescribing everything from killing others to consuming unkosher food, men are positively obligated to a great many of the defining behaviors of Jewish life. Just two examples, study and prayer, that women are not. In particular, those commandments that are linked to time, such as, for example, the requirement to pray 3 times a day in a quorum of 10 men, are not obligatory for women. Because women are not obliged to take part in these activities, they therefore literally do not count in a prayer quorum. So, the old saw is you can have 9 men and 500 women, and you don't have a quorum for prayer. You can pray, but you can't say the most central prayers required. In addition, Jewish law views gender as a fundamental form of differentiation and separation of all sorts. Garments are gendered, both in prayer and ordinary life, and activities are differentiated. There are lively debates to be had in Judaism as well as Islam and other traditions about whether these matters disadvantage women or not. But what is more interesting to me is that Judaism is built around differentiated gender status. Every right and every duty is determined by law in Judaism and not contract. Legal status is gendered. That is the bottom line of what we might call in anthropology a Jewish worldview. As Jews sought rights in Germany and France and England in the 19th century, their religion was scrutinized for its suitability to European life. Women's status was often used as the central example of Judaism's what was called in the West with horror and contempt Orientalism. Therefore, the Jewish Enlightenment, which in Hebrew is called Haskalah, there was a Jewish version of the Enlightenment, and with it the stirrings of the leaders of Reform Judaism, made the issue of the treatment of women one of the centerpieces of their program, because the larger society did. The equality of women meant, depending on whether it was Germany or the United States or England, where women were seated in worship. For example, in the US it meant men and women sitting together. In Germany it meant they sat across from one another in aisles. It also meant an ideology of the value of domesticity for women, even more important in Europe than it was in the United States. And in the United States, a much greater presence in synagogue life for women. These same issues of equality were very much actively pursued in the United States. So the Enlightenment, driven by European notions of what was human and acceptable, forced the issue of women's equality on Jews. I'm not sure they would have gone after it without it, and then determined how it would be played out. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Jewish women were most likely to make a claim less for equality than for an active role in communal life. So the first stirrings of women-directed Jewish feminism in the United States did not use the language of equality, but more active presence, public presence, visibility, in search of what might be still called equality. Their rationale was the centrality of women to the reproduction of Judaism. Women had to raise the next generation, therefore they had to be visible and present, or how could they do it? They saw themselves as, in fact, saving Judaism for its future because too many men had abandoned it for capitalist joys. There were exemplary women leaders in the 19th century and early 20th century. There were women educators. There was even what we might think of as a rabbi in the Western United States who was a woman. There were women philanthropists. Many were committed to women's suffrage, very involved in it. Some opposed it. But the complex roots of equality, meaning the claim for access, including that was based on, now you know, anti-Semitism, Jewish anxiety, the valuing of modernity. In the United States, the presence of Protestantism as a model of how women should be, and suffrage, should underline, rather than obscure, the Enlightenment vision by which Jews could remain Jews. This is still an Enlightenment program. This vision of women's equality was more akin to a world of separate spheres, an implicit acceptance of the fundamental difference between men and women, but at the same time elaborating and expanding women's roles in public life. The ground for equality was, as I explained at the outset, Western concepts in service, paradoxically perhaps, of the persistence of Judaism, by no means assimilation. The earliest stirrings of Jewish feminism sought acculturation. At the same time, its leaders reimagined women's relationship to Judaism and to public life. And these women leaders fell prey to exactly what Joan Scott argued was feminism's paradox. Jewish women deserved equality in their view, but the women who were at the forefront of those efforts were often affluent, women of German and Western European descent. They certainly did not have Eastern European immigrant women in mind in their efforts, other than to completely alter their lives. They worked actively to change their Jewish practices, whether those Jewish practices were a kind of Judaism or a utopian Jewish socialism and anarchism. For these exemplars of modernity, then, gender equality was both the medium of acculturation to America and the coalescence of class. Exactly as we now know is the sort of besetting sin, in a way, of second-wave feminism. But with second-wave feminisms, feminism came different rationales for equality, and that emerged beginning in the 1970s. So we have a long break from sort of the 20s through until the 1970s, when these issues emerge again. They take slightly different forms, with men and women sitting together in more traditional synagogues, but they largely go sort of underground until the rise of second wave feminism. I mean, we could talk about that. It's more complicated than that, but we'll leave it at that. And even in the 1970s, we have two rather different foundations for what are meant by equality. And they keep evolving. They haven't stopped. They're still very much alive in the 21st century as well. So I want to talk about these two different ones. They're kind of ideal types. They're overdrawn in their differences, but they're interesting nevertheless. The first Jewish feminist claim is most effectively glossed by terms, I think, that the women who are interested in it used, and that was empowerment. It's a very powerful symbolic term. We want empowerment in Judaism. We want to be empowered. The term obviously comes from the larger culture. Now, a number of scholars have suggested that this move for empowerment really actually abandoned a true feminist critique, because it allowed women to get along, to even privatize what they most wanted, rather than to really challenge a larger patriarchal structure. But the empowerers, if we could use that word, the empowerers' call for their inclusion was radical in its own way, because they didn't simply want to include women, but rather they demanded that they wanted women's experience to be realized in Jewish life and Jewish practice. Research by both historians and anthropologists such as Jody Myers, Vanessa Oakes, and Pamela Nadell, among many, many others, examines the way in which empowerment works in such areas as the development of distinctive ritual objects. So, for example, there's quite an active business around producing something called Miriam's Cup, which is used at the Seder, a holiday that we just all experienced a few weeks ago, in which at the center of the table is put a cup in honor of the prophet Miriam, who was followed everywhere she went in the Exodus by water. And when she died, the children of Israel never had water access again. So rather than focusing on the prophet Elijah, who has the traditional cup at the table, there's a woman's cup, remembering a prophet or prophetess, as empowerers like to call her, and giving her the status of a prophet and of a significant figure. Another ritual object that has emerged is a tambourine. And women have tambourines. They do a variety of things with them. They play them, they display them, they have them on the table, emulating women who danced at the Red Sea after the Egyptians drowned, a subject also of some complexity, depending on your politics at the Seder. But the tambourine is a woman's object, used by women, for women. And Vanessa Oakes, who did ethnographic research on this, found it really interestingly that the tambourine is used also by women who we might think of as the extreme religious right wing, Lubavitch Chabad, who use it for messianic reasons, and who certainly have no idea whatsoever about all those feminist seders going on where liberal Jews are making use of them, but interestingly also used as a female symbol. I doubt they would use the word empowerment, but in some ways it's implied by their practice. Empowerers developed female rituals, sometimes by uncovering old ones, like a celebration of the new moon, literally one that was repressed for years and years, or altogether inventing new ones, involving storytelling or other kinds of things. Empowerers are also advocates for the revision of liturgies, modifying traditional ones, creating entirely new ones, making use not only of the great patriarchal figures of the most important prayer in Jewish liturgy, but also invoking the mothers, not just the fathers. And interestingly, empowerers are found across the spectrum of Judaisms in the United States. To a lesser extent in Europe and Latin America, very little in Israel. So it's definitely transnational, but it takes its fullest expression here. Like their 19th century foremothers that I described above, they remain committed to the uniqueness of women's experience, but no longer solely as a medium for uplifting the family. In some settings, yes, but in many not. They are committed to being reflected, a consistent image in Judaism as women. They're very central in Jewish renewal, which some people could think of as the newest denomination in Judaism, or many think of as heretical, and beyond the pale of what can still count as Judaism. But essential images of women and women's ritual and women's garments are a very important part of renewal for both men and women, and very much a part of lesbian spirituality as well. Though some of these issues engage Jewish law, they actually do very little. When they do engage, what they do engage is related to the system of law that separates Jews' status by gender, creating difference that they see as erasure. If Jewish women experience marginalization in Jewish practice, it is certainly because of Jewish law, but as these and other scholars argue, this form of Jewish feminism is not particularly interested in challenging the legal system, but simply sidestepping it, ignoring it, undermining it. Insofar as empowerment is the foundation of the claim for equality, it can, as some of its critics argue, be highly accommodationist and lacking any radical critique at all, which we think of as central to feminism. Can women pursue their empowerment without concern for deeper issues of inequality? Is inequality just assumed in a women-oriented practice? Is their religiosity more secular because it sidesteps rather than confronts tradition through the medium of liberal religion? Do they opt out and opt in at the same time? The best analogy for the empowerers in second-wave feminism is likely a cultural feminism, interested in pursuing women's experience in art and music, religion, and a variety of other spaces, a form of feminism that was, of course, very much critiqued by more political, and they would like to think radical feminists who were very dismissive of cultural feminism. But in the secular world and in Judaism, these feminists pursue a different concept of equality that is grounded in experience and faithfulness to realizing one's own self. Have they, ironically, escaped the Enlightenment paradox? They are dismissed by some feminists, but they are very dismissive of others. They raise the question, of course, of what equality means. Unlike those within the traditional system, like orthodoxy, who don't reject change. Their vision for change is grounded in the experiential, which we could think of as a kind of 60s postmodern, the beginning of a kind of postmodern view of human subjectivity. So the third of our feminisms, and Jewish feminisms, and the second of the second wave, is the one I want to turn to now. And it is the one that is most directly influenced by the feminist critique of patriarchy associated with the second wave. Those feminists who engage the vocabulary of equality are most likely to be the ones concerned with Jewish law, which in Hebrew is called halakha, which actually means the way, not law, Jewish theology, and the huge library of Jewish texts that are all related to the foundational structures of Jewish life. They constitute ways of Jewish knowing and categorizing. They are, to my mind, the most fundamental construction of Jewishness. In this work, scholars, and these are preeminent Jewish thinkers, such as Tamar Ross, Rachel Adler, Judith Plaskow, Judith Hauptman, and many others, have been forced to wrestle with the meaning of equality as it contravenes Jewish systems of structuring experience. Even as a dynamic process, which Jewish law certainly exemplifies, hierarchy and inequality among genders is central. It's irreducible. All of these thinkers, activists, in one way or another, embracing Jewish law, rejecting Jewish law, giving Jewish law a vote, or even offering it a partial veto, must find a language to integrate equality into a system not of enlightened citizens, which after all is the model of modernity, but of hierarchy and differentiation. Judaism is not about citizenship. It's about obligation to God built on gender. And it is this engagement with these competing systems that is what is unique both to Jewish feminism within Western feminism, this very anti-patriarchal, and to a feminism that critiques and embraces religion as more than a tool of patriarchy. Jewish feminists must reject certain aspects of Judaism in order to maintain it. More often than not, feminists are drawn to arguments or experiences that suggest that Jewish practice, but especially Jewish law, is flawed because of its inequality, and that it requires radical change. What's especially interesting about this is that Orthodox feminists, who call themselves Torah true feminists, do not want to change practice. They are completely obligated by it. What they want to change is the foundation of inequality. And so the most Orthodox, the most committed will say, it's time to simply do this. We won't change anything else, but we will not accept difference as a legitimate basis for Jewish law, even though we don't want to change anything else. What separates this group of Jewish feminists from what I call the 19th century women maternalists or the empowerers is that women who were concerned with or continue to be concerned with education or where men and women sit or the autonomy of Jewish women is that really none of them are interested in challenging the fundamental domain of Judaism. In contrast to 19th century reformers, they maintain the legal system as halakha, as central to Jewish life. The Orthodox remain Orthodox. They just want to undermine law. But like that period, it still calls on modernity and enlightenment to make men and women equal, to make women full Jews on the model of the Jewish male. And in so doing, it replicates the Enlightenment paradox. One could ask of Orthodox feminists committed to law, are all women in the class of women? Are lesbians women? Are Jews who challenge Jewish law women? Orthodox women describe feeling condescended to by feminists, who in turn feel written out of Judaism by Orthodox feminists. So we have 3 examples of Jewish feminists whose claim for what we would gloss as equality have overlapping but different foundations for their claims. Ironically, at least to me, maybe you will not think of it as an irony, the most traditional claim for feminism is the most radical and the most religious in Western terms. And all of the claims separate Jewish women from one another and from all other feminisms that are not Jewish, that engendered them. Maternalists, empowerers, and halachists attempt to envision from within and without and trouble the concept of equality. So I draw then 3 questions, and these are the questions I'd like to conclude with that I hope we can talk about, that are interesting enough to me that I'd love to know what you think about them. So I draw 3 questions and conclusions from the Jewish example as a perspective on women and religion. First, and I think most straightforwardly, and no surprise, equality requires constant scrutiny and historicizing. The more it is linked to classic Enlightenment, potentially the more it dissembles, the more it lies, the more it's dishonest. But it nevertheless returns us to the central question of gender and culture. What do we mean by equality? What does it mean within particular contexts? Second of all, and this is the broadest question, equality is troubled by boundaries. Equality is troubled by boundaries. Every cultural system constructs complex boundaries between not just us and them, the most profound cultural construction, but between every possible imaginable sense of difference in a whole range of societies, complex, etc. Boundedness, according to one of the teachers of my younger days, Emil Durkheim, is the cultural condition. The great intellectual work of every stripe of cultural studies and post-structuralism is built on the following assumptions. Boundaries are hierarchic. Hierarchy is normative. Normativity is punitive. Therefore, boundaries and hierarchy And the deconstruction of boundaries and hierarchy has been among the greatest work of scholars in the late 20th and beginning of the 21st century. But after the work of deconstruction, which I'm sure you all know is the most exciting thing to do, we are still burdened with the complexity of life. We are burdened with real cultures and real people operating within them, and not the domain of deconstruction, which can be politically mobilizing and brilliant, but often, to my mind, doesn't help us negotiate where people actually live. So, for example, given the examples we talked about today, and this is certainly what Joan Scott is addressing, why do women, quote unquote, choose anti-modernism as strategies in political struggle? Why do women put on the veil? Why did they do it in Algeria? Why did they do it in Iran? Why are they doing it in France today? How does the affirmation of anti-modernism affirm a life that is profoundly engaged? When Orthodox feminists affirm themselves as Torah true, they seek radical change with an absolute observance. If these choices for difference, boundaries, and boundedness are not equality, then what shall we call them? And how should they be conceptualized? What is the theoretical move after deconstruction when we engage issues about women and religion? And finally, we'll want to add another paradox to Joan Scott's focus on sameness and difference. How do we combine the Enlightenment notion of equality on the model of the citizen with indigenous notions of personhood? What I described as gendered status in Jewish law. In practice, on the ground, do we learn about the complexity of evolving worldviews? Do we see how they are played out in this thing I'm annoyingly calling real life? Do we find them in personal politics? Do we see them in the family? Do we see them in the community? Talal Asad, a really profound scholar of secularism and religion, always writes about looking at religious structures in action, never understanding them apart from the way they're negotiated in a madras, in any sort of encounter. Yes, we scrutinize and we deconstruct secularism to deny its illusory promise, great work that's already begun. But then what do we make of the liberal project of religious change, which is secular in some ways, religious in others, and very much the ground of so much feminist work? And then finally, we're brought back to where it all began, to power. How do we then talk about inequity, asymmetry, and women's rights as we've complicated and undermined all the issues of the Enlightenment which have given rise to these key questions? So for me, that's the dilemma of the study of women and religion. So I'd love to open up to a conversation. I'd be happy to. Yes.
How was Queen Esther do?
Excuse me. Could you start by introducing yourselves, which I would. Okay.
How was Queen Esther viewed?
By whom?
By the provisions of feminism.
Do you mean by the people I'm calling the empowerers?
Right. Do you see any different role for her?
Well, there are. There are interesting ways that she's talked and written about. I did field work in the 1970s in a Jewish community, and I remember that in that early wave of Jewish feminism, people would wear costumes with signs that said, "Queen Esther is a right-on woman," or whatever. And there are Purim plays at Purim time, and they take many different forms. They are long-standing, and I can tell you that during that period of the 70s, there were a lot of Purim plays about the relationship between Esther and the woman she replaced, Vashti. For those of you who may not be familiar with the story of Purim and Esther, first of all, it's a remarkable text. God's name is never mentioned in it, and it gives play to a lot of interesting things as a result. So a king who was viewed as not particularly bright has this wife named Vashti, and he drinks a lot and entertains a lot, and he demands that Vashti appear in her raiment, which scholars interpret as naked. And Vashti refuses to go. It's basically another play on who's on top. So she leaves, and so the king has to get a new wife, and so there's a beauty contest that lasts for a year, believe it or not, and whatever. And the woman who emerges as his bride, his beloved chosen queen, is Jewish, but she keeps her Judaism a secret, which is why you would definitely understand this is not an exemplary text in many ways. So it's a very complex and interesting text, but for feminists, it brought this very interesting dynamic between Vashti and Esther, who was the radical, who wasn't, and it's an identical parallelism to the story of creation, which in rabbinic midrash has a first wife who refuses literally to lie down underneath Adam. Lilith was her name. She's expelled from the Garden of Eden, and then the second time around they get Eve, who works better. So the first feminist Jewish magazine was called Lilith. There is no big trade, as far as I know, in Vashti. Vashti named things, but it's a great thing for you to bring up because these stories then get retold in the context of the 70s. Vashti would not, I think, have ever been praised in an Orthodox setting, but Esther has been reinterpreted. So it's a rich, lively tradition that continues to unfold, and feminists certainly brought Lilith into a very new place. This anthropologist, Vanessa Oakes, actually has written about the difference between not so much Vashti and Esther, but Vashti and Miriam, you know, Miriam's cup, whatever. And Oakes talks about the fact that Vashti, who was an early Jewish feminist heroine in many ways, gets displaced by Miriam. So who's Miriam in the book of Exodus? She's Moses' sister. She gets along well with everyone. She doesn't make any trouble. She does dance and sing at the sea, which is kind of a great thing. But Oakes' argument is that Vashti disappears by the time the empowerers really come around because Miriam is a more accommodating figure. There was nothing accommodating about Lilith or Vashti. So I hope that answers your question to some extent. These figures get played with as role models and whatever, but Vashti has really, you could definitely see Vashti has been completely replaced by Miriam. Miriam has all the objects, Miriam is everywhere, and Oakes at least argues that Miriam is a far tamer figure and hence less threatening. It's an interesting argument.
So I should have called my daughter Vashti and not Miriam?
Well, it depends how much you'd like her to be able to play with other children in certain cultural contexts.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm sort of interested in these, the latter two forms and in relation to class.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, if there's sort of a class differentiation or not. And then the other is not entirely related, but just sort of interested in the production process of, like, who decides to make this new kind of cup? I mean, how does that actually sort of, the material, like, who are the people, who are the actors sort of involved? I'm not so familiar with this part of the literature. I mean, have there been ethnographies that actually look at the production and consumption of these things, how they actually play out?
That's a wonderful question. This person, Vanessa Oakes, is somebody who really writes about these objects. Mm-hmm. And she has a book out about ritual objects and how they're used. She pays a little attention to production. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the web has made everything so much more possible for selling art in a lot of ways. But the whole interest in art definitely comes out of a cultural turn in Judaism, paying attention to that, legitimating art as against scholarship alone, finding roots in Jewish art, finding women's art. This all comes out of both the counterculture and then the women's movement, and it's very much built on that. And there are artists, and they train, and for example, calligraphy was brought back as an art form and takes certain forms and all of that. So it's fascinating. And a great field, and Vanessa Oakes is the person who's written about it as a feminist. I think that's sort of interesting. And I do think the internet, what happened is there are gatherings, there are renewal gatherings, spiritual gatherings of these renewal movements where these objects are sold a lot. Jewish art fairs develop, that kind of stuff does. So the whole widening scheme of what is an appropriate object for ritual use has just democratized in a million ways, every single whatever. I mean, when I grew up, a prayer shawl was a male object that was white and black, and it had black stripes to remember the loss of Jerusalem. And now you can find a prayer shawl of every type imaginable, representing every political view, every cultural view. You can find women-oriented ones, whatever. And it's all a part of this sort of handcraft type thing that really came out of the 60s, I think, and then found a marketplace. So, and remind me of the first question again?
I was just interested in terms of
class.
Yeah.
Class is a great subject. It's a great subject because Jewish affiliation, meaning people who in some way affiliate through belonging to a synagogue or an alternative group even or whatever, is an overwhelmingly middle-class enterprise. And it's different in Orthodoxy, where there are still huge class issues, but class is looked at in different ways. I was contacted by a woman who's writing a dissertation at the University of Chicago, who studied both in a large population sample and then interviews converts to Judaism, not in the sense of Christians who become Jews, but liberal Jews who become Orthodox Jews. And she has found, and can't find anything in the literature that talks about this, though it's fascinating, that these people over and over uses the rationale for this choice, too much pressure for achievement growing up, feeling those were false values. Not to say that these people are not lawyers or whatever, or accountants, but a rejection of liberal Judaism as a rejection of suburbanization, a focus on achievement cut off from some sacred connection, and it's very interesting. It's very interesting. So there's no question that, as it's called, affiliation in the Jewish community is often something very middle class, and it is not that way in Orthodoxy. There's more poverty in Orthodoxy, though there's also greater wealth. So there's great wealth, not greater, but great wealth. So the class dimension of what we're looking at in these kinds of feminisms after the immigrant period, I would say very much mirrors Jewish social class, which is firmly middle class to upper middle class. But the groups that are more interested in breakaway or experimentation or whatever are more outside the mainstream, and so in that sense I think they would vary. But as a white population here, many generations, white ethnics, definitely the class phenomenon we're talking about is middle to upper middle. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Rachel Ellis. I'm an undergraduate at Georgetown. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more the idea of rejecting the foundation of difference without changing practice in the halakha.
It's a great question because you still have to struggle to come up for a rationale, and the rationale always brings you back to the Enlightenment. And again, there was a Jewish Enlightenment, so perhaps it's not fair to say it's alien or not. But within Orthodoxy, within an Orthodox feminist movement, and we can talk about that movement and how interesting it is, there is the sense. So, for example, there's an Israeli Orthodox woman named Tamar Ross, an intellectual, an academic, and from a long rabbinic family and married to a rabbi. You know, nobody cared about what the wacko feminists thought, but here was somebody from inside the tradition, and there are more women like that, who wrote a theology, who laid out principles and basically said the distinction between men and women is stupid. It's outmoded. Other things change historically. It's time for this to change. There is no legitimate rationale. What's interesting is that these Orthodox women often make an appeal to faith, especially at the beginning of second-wave feminism, in which they say, the God to whom I pray would not do this to women. Where am I left if the God to whom I pray would do this? And by the way, the first Orthodox rabbi who has come out publicly as a gay man, Steve Greenberg, has written a brilliant book that basically says the same thing. I mean, there's an appeal to faith and rationality. The God who created me would not make me something that can't be a Jew. So that is not possible. that theology is impossible. So basically on theological grounds of private faith, which is not all that well developed in my understanding of Judaism, and on a secular, a frank acknowledgement of secular historical grounding, those appeals are made while holding and maintaining Judaism. So that's the way it's made. So just a couple of weeks ago, clearly because I was coming here today, a great example emerged. There are many kinds of orthodoxy, as I'm sure you know, and there is a strand of orthodoxy called modern Orthodox, which is more open to acknowledging change. And they are also under enormous attack all the time for not being Orthodox. And in that movement, they have begun to train women to play what we might call para-rabbinic roles, to be teachers, to counsel people, not just women, but to counsel people, to work with people, and to play a role, but to not yet be called rabbi. They have to pass legal tests the way any rabbi would. They have to show tremendous knowledge. And there are two different terms that are used for those women. One going back to Italy in the medieval period, which acknowledged a woman of expertise, and another more recent one. And first, the two women who play this, have this role in New York, were given that term, and then it was upgraded to the medieval Italian one. And a war opened, and the modern Orthodox rabbis backed down because they were told by rabbis to the right of them that they wouldn't be acknowledged in a variety of ways. And this is not just an honorific. Their rulings wouldn't be accepted. There are these various things. Today in Israel, for example, women are allowed to represent women going through a divorce proceedings, where women are very much, as you may know, vulnerable and at risk. They have to pass extensive legal tests, whatever. They have standing in rabbinic courts. So there are all kinds of ways, very slowly and in very interesting ways, that women are gaining power that would have literally been unimaginable 2 decades ago. But these women accept the limits. And the women who have this kind of para-rabbinic role were horrified when they became the center of this conflict and said, we don't want to talk about it because we don't want to lose what we have. So we all know about these discussions about change and what does change mean and what is real change and is it legitimate. But these are some of the examples of the ways that by challenging and not challenging the grounding of orthodoxy, some pretty revolutionary changes are happening. Anyone at that modern Orthodox end will tell you, not in my lifetime, but sometime they're going to be rabbis. On the other hand, then what happens? And what happens is the response back becomes even more ferocious. So we see this with ordination of gay bishops in the Episcopalian Church and the end of a world church. And that split. Is there any way to hold on to a world episcopate in that way? Yes, no. Is it worth it? What will happen? The same thing will happen in Orthodoxy. It'll move more slowly. It's different. It's not hierarchic in the same way. People don't get to vote. They vote with their feet or they vote in other ways. But this ability to actually literally say, you as an Orthodox rabbi will no longer be recognized in this umbrella group, is a place where these men have not yet been willing to go. They go as far as they can, and then they pull back. And there are lots of examples like this. So does that make sense about how you can have both and, or maybe neither or? But it is definitely about incremental change. Yes?
Hi, I'm Susan Terrio. I'm an anthropologist here at Georgetown. I'm so sorry I missed the first part of your talk because I was stuck in traffic trying to get here. But actually, I was going to ask for you to talk a little bit about the exchanges between the Torah true feminists and the various rabbinical Orthodox traditions. You've already done that a little bit. But I'm also wondering, are you looking at sort of the ways, sort of the resistances and the tensions that these women experience within their own families? and the ways in which they're trying to bring up children or influence grandchildren, and sort of the tensions within a smaller sort of sphere, family and community, and how that's playing out, because we know that the liberals, liberal Jews are becoming orthodox in some sense, and I'm wondering if there's a counter trend to that.
Well, it's so sad. I'm sorry you asked me.
Oh.
And I'll tell you why. Because on the one hand, there's all these remarkable things going on. There's just no question. And there is a growing organization of Orthodox women. It's huge. It's called Jaffa. They meet every year. They, feature lots of study. Their knowledge, the base of women being able to study is almost unprecedented, both in the United States and in Israel. And that's the only way they're going to break these barriers. But if you ask these women, they would say that their numbers are very small. Why? The single thing that is, because many, many of these women still live in communities where there's arranged marriage. And, the basis of the arrangement may be everybody has to have at least a master's degree, or they have to have this or whatever, but, not unlike many Hindus who live in the United States from India, this is becoming an increasingly common phenomenon. They know that if a girl's mother is seen as a feminist, or her family in some way is part of this, this will affect her ability to get married. I mean, this is what you call playing for keeps, right? So, as you of course know, change always moves in a variety of directions. A lot is happening, a lot is moving forward, but there's still a lot of caution and a lot of anxiety about the ability of people to make marriages who are seen as too ambitious, too this, too that. I mean, for any of you who may not know, one of the most interesting things about Orthodoxy is that women work. This is not, the Christian notion of the lady and the whore, or ideas have ever been part of Judaism in which women were not seen as very much in the world. That's a negative, actually. I mean, it's not a negative, but it's lower on a hierarchic scale. So it's not as though these young women aren't imagined as being economically productive, or they're not assuming that their husbands will study for some period of time. Education isn't a problem other than in the extreme right wing of Orthodoxy, where it's a problem for everybody, male and female. But how you write that, sort of walk that line between being in the world but not being seen as a feminist is very alive and well. So that's why it's a tough question. It's tough. Yeah.
I'm sorry, a bit of a bad throat, but I'm sort of curious actually about that statement, because I think what you said was that the great work of deconstruction was to take away this notion of the Enlightenment, but really, can you think of any other discourse that can shape things in a collective and social way, other than, because I think for me, I'm sorry if I'm being very unclear.
No, I get it. But go ahead, say more, but you're not being unclear.
But what really surprises me is the people you're identifying as the radical feminists, is there's no way to reshape and attack the tradition that isn't personal. And when things just become entirely personal, it becomes a question of voting with your feet, which in actual reality, the lived structure which we underlie, it's not only personal, and it's not really able to vote with your feet. So,
tell me what you mean by personal. By the appeal to faith? What do you mean by that?
The woman who wrote the book saying that I don't believe that we can have these rules because I pray to this God and there's no way this God can exist, and if I can't be a Jew. And in the same way, I think the gay rabbi, right. But when you reshape those things, it becomes an entirely personal project. Can you really talk about actually attacking or reshaping the foundation of any religious tradition, which by its inherent nature has never been personal? I don't think it.
Okay. Well, you raise many, many interesting questions. So let me begin by saying that the attack on the Enlightenment, the deconstruction of the Enlightenment, its purpose is to show that it's principles were never realized, that the notion of the equality of man was always based on hierarchy and not equality. So its ideology was always underwritten by many, many forms that were thought of as antithetical. Okay? So at the other end, as Joan Scott raises, is if in feminist thought equality is the greatest good and patriarchy makes equality impossible, she, like the anthropologist Talal Asad, asked to understand what are the foundations of secularism, because secularism does not secularism does not guarantee equality, as we well know, and does religion then, the flip side, necessitate inequality? So the question you raise, that's a very powerful one, is if we change things, can they be the same? That is, if I say, not God commanded me, but I choose to be commanded, does that eliminate the system? Can it not work, as you put it? Can personal choice ever be the foundation of any religious system? And what I would say to you is that is a very complex and profound question, because we could say that what keeps systems working is social norms. People don't wake up every morning internalizing very much on their own the desire to do, to pay taxes or to go to class. There are social norms, there are rewards, there are all kinds of things that make that possible. And, to say the obvious, modernity got in the way of a lot of that in those things that we call religious. So everyone is a product of modernity, whether you, live in Williamsburg, New York, in a world that might appear, on the one hand, completely outside of modernity, in which people dress like it's Poland in the 1800s, but they have computers and they carefully monitor what their kids can have access to, but they're on the internet and all of these things. So what you're asking about basically is, what is the impact of modernity on tradition, or what is the impact of modernity on religion? And when sexuality and gender become part of that question, which they do increasingly, can you hold on to that system, or what does that system look like? And the best I can say to you is these systems always changed. They only have the illusion, and their practitioners believe that they didn't. They were always changing. They were always evolving. They were profoundly influenced by Islam for the Jews living in Islam, by Christianity for the Jews living in Europe, and they will continue to evolve. But there is no question, as we've seen in a post-feminist, I'm sorry to say, as people call today, that all of those moves always bring tremendous backlashes. And the backlashes are the product of modernity. Secularism is the product of religion. Religion is the product of secularism. And so I think as anthropologists we would say, you watch the way it plays out. You look within historical context, you see how it plays out on the ground, rather than looking only from the perspective of the system. Does that make sense?
Well, actually, I think for me, sorry, but I'm not sure if it's entirely about the question of modernity upsetting structures in itself. Modernity is part of the process which it is playing out, yes, but the specific question is about, like, how you underline, like what you underline, the place of subjectivity in a form of faith. And actually to say it continually evolves, and it's always continued to evolve, yes, of course, everything can be historicized and everything changes, but, sometimes you have to ask the question, like how you put it, can it exist? The notion that things will continue to evolve, as you put it, specifically presumes that all the traditions can coexist and live together. But there is a problem with that. I don't know anything particular about Judaism, but I've seen, say, for example, how the Anglican Church,
Right.
how that has been literally riven apart on even this one question. It's, I think, not a question which can actually just be answered by, it's historicized and so it's going to continue
Right.
to change, rather than the place of this subjective relation?
Well, here's what I would say. Yes, and I think the Anglican Church is a great example. The break-off who have gone with what we might call a liberal Anglicanism that recognize homosexuality, and the conservatives are both going to change as a result of this split. And from my point of view, the important thing would be to say that neither one of them will stay the same. Now, I appreciate that I appreciate your wise view that historicizing isn't exactly an answer. But I'm not sure what other answer we can have as long as we guard against the sense that one will maintain tradition and one won't. They will both change because it is the nature of culture or religion or whatever to change. Today, I think any legitimate scholar of Judaism would say that there are multiple Judaisms in America, let alone in the world. I think for a long time people believed there really was a Judaism. Nobody believes that anymore. People may say it, they may continue to invoke the great principles that the Jewish people are one people and all of that, and to some extent that's true. There are multiple Judaisms. And there have been multiple Judaisms before, a very long time ago, and there will be in the future. But that is a product of modernity in a way that it really wasn't in previous periods. And now we'll say the same thing about the Anglican Church. There is not a single church. So I don't know if that's an answer to you. I appreciate the point you bring in. It's an important one. And, I hope you can, see that I'm making a strong case for the dynamism of tradition in all its forms. Yes?
My name is Laura Tomes. I'm a PhD student in the Religion Department. Sort of taking note of your three critiques about equality and its dependence on modernity and the Enlightenment citizen, which well taken, and sort of looking towards a form of Jewish feminism which is able to find a different kind of foundation for talking about women's differentiation. I'm wondering if Sephardi and Mizrahi voices have a contribution to make here, having a very different relationship with modernity, a different epistemological relationship. And I don't know, I'm ignorant about whether there are any particular voices coming out of the Sephardi and Mizrahi community that are able to formulate versions of women's differentiation in different ways without the sort of the foothold in the Enlightenment Foundation and in Enlightened citizenship?
It's a wonderful question. Obviously, it means very different things in Israel than it means in the United States, where the communities are different, but related in some ways. The major work being done about Mizrahi women is more historical now, that I'm aware of. But I think it will evolve. But I will tell you an anecdote that is not an answer, but certainly underlines Joan Scott's point, and that is many years ago there was a gathering at Brandeis of Jewish feminists, scholars. And I was so happy to go because here I was stuck all the time with mainstream feminism, women's studies, never acknowledging difference, racial difference maybe, but never religious difference, whatever. And I think, at last I'm going home. This will be the true place for me. And the first speaker the first day stood up and said, I'm a Mizrahi woman. I'm tired of domination by Ashkenazic women, and just blasted this whole illusion I had. I thought, for 2 minutes, it would have been nice to imagine that there was some commonality here. But of course, there is no condition, whatever feminists would like to believe, that is not ultimately going to be about differentiation. And so they have been so oppressed for so long by the Ashkenazic hegemony in every possible way that this will definitely evolve in different ways. There are many, many Iranian Jews in Los Angeles, for example. I mean, this would have to happen in large communities. They're very different and interesting communities. In New Jersey, the Syrians have been a fairly closed community. So this sort of happens over time. There was one Sephardic woman ordained as a rabbi and accepted and whatever, but it's happening. It's happening in interesting ways. These things happen. Novels get written. Poetry gets written. There are a lot of artistic expressions that start, and that in many ways precedes it. But it's definitely not going to happen I think, what I really appreciate about your question in the same way of what I'm describing. And I think that's just a great add-on. So doesn't anybody want to help me out with this problem of what do you do after you deconstruct boundaries? Something that I think about all the time, or what's the next step, or how do you deal with it, or when you've deconstructed patriarchy and when you've deconstructed, you know, it's not like what do you do? That's interesting too. What do you do conceptually? I mean, one move is to say, the ethnographic move. You watch it play out on the ground. You see what it means. You see how people live it. And maybe that's the best corrective of all, which is why everyone does ethnography. Remember when just anthropologists used to do ethnography? When people in the English department said they did ethnography many years ago, that was a little hard for me. And then they hate anthropologists who think they own ethnography. I've been through all of that. But I don't know. Am I the only one who thinks about this? Does anyone else around the table worry about this problem? If not, that's okay.
Oh, I worry about it.
Oh, good. Well, say something.
No, I'm struck listening to you by the similarities of the issues with those of us who work with indigenous people who are in the processes of cultural recovery. A lot of the same things happen.
Right.
And we have this real problem, which is that we're taught to deconstruct everything and to not see cultural hypocrisy and to not see boundaries and to not essentialize. And then that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Mm-hmm.
They're not totally doing that. They're also deconstructing, but I think you have to do ethnography to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
They're not deconstructing in the same way we are.
Mm-hmm.
They're deconstructing in order to construct something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have to learn to set aside our theoretical background sometimes, and we have to accept, which it's a real problem when you're, for example, in a panel with indigenous people who are speaking, and other people say, oh, they sound like Nazis. They don't. But I think we need to, I think we may need to just set aside deconstruction to some extent and learn how to deconstruct in other ways, which is how some of these actors do it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're problematizing who they think they are. They're not saying that it's that it's Jews are Jews are Jews.
Mm-hmm.
How are they deconstructing? Which is, I guess, what it sounds like you're talking about.
It's the same question.
Yeah. How do we then put that into our own academic practice? Of course, then what we write ends up sounding very strange to other anthropologists.
Thank you. That's a help.